Welcome, everyone. We're about to start this workshop on unlocking the power of strategic litigation. And let me make a qualification right away to that title. We're actually going to be talking a little more broadly than litigation. We're going to be talking about strategic casework. But having said that, I'm Gillian Dell. I'm chair of the UNCAC Coalition, and I also work at Transparency International. And I want to thank at the outset the workshop coordinators who prepared this session, this very important session, I should say. Sarah Bramboeuf of TI France, who unfortunately couldn't be here, and Bettina Pasteknik of the UNCAC Coalition, who we're very grateful to for all the work going into preparing this. We have 3 civil society representatives who have important experience to share with this audience about strategic casework, as well as a public prosecutor who will be sharing her reflections on how that looks from the prosecutor's perspective, and also a representative of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, who will be adding insights about the role of strategic casework and possible avenues within the UN system. So just to say, the structure of the workshop, after I'll make a few remarks, we'll be hearing from all of our panelists, and then there will be an opportunity, we hope an ample opportunity of about 30 minutes for Q&A. And finally, we'll be hearing from our panelists with some concluding remarks. Who do we have with us? We have, in order to my left, we have Charlotte Palmieri, who is Advocacy and Strategic Litigation Officer at Transparency International France. We have Adriana Greaves, co-founder and co-director of TOHIL, a Mexico-based NGO that combats corruption. We have Gabrielle Bourdon-Fatal of PLAF, who is the programs director there. We have Céline Guillet, public prosecutor in the French Financial Public Prosecutor's Office, which in French is the Parquet National Financier, or PNF. And last but not least, we have Maria Jose Veramendi Villa, who is the Anti-Corruption and Human Rights Officer at the UN OHCHR, or High Commission for Human Rights. So just a few words before we get into the substance and hear from our speakers and from their rich experience and insights. First off, what do we mean by strategic litigation, or more broadly, strategic casework? Strategic casework is a powerful tool that involves the identification and pursuit of legal cases as part of a strategy to bring about broader social change and have a lasting impact. This may be achieved through setting important legal precedents, as well as by publicly exposing injustices, raising awareness, and bringing about changes in legislation, policy, and practice. The available avenues may be at national level, but also at regional and international levels. Strategic litigation is increasingly and rightfully recognized and used by civil society as a promising approach to bring about change and to advance in casework. But thus far, we see it as rather underutilized as an option for civil society work. It's an indispensable tool for achieving change, and it provides opportunities for victims of corruption to be represented and compensated, something that's not happening enough in cases, in enforcement cases against corruption. And it also offers an opportunity for unifying the human rights and anti-corruption agendas. So we'd like to see NGOs or CSOs building on the important advances that have so far been brought by strategic litigation. And we're taking inspiration from examples in the areas of climate change and human rights advocacy. We know that the experience of anti-corruption NGOs, even if limited, shows that their broad and effective standing to bring such cases and to pursue such cases can strengthen the role of law enforcement authorities in their detection and investigation of corruption practices, and to a certain extent even compensate for the failures of international cooperation. And we also know that the legal standing that has been offered in some cases and in some countries can be a means to denounce and pursue human rights violations, offering victims of corruption another avenue to claim redress. So the potential for this tool is actually links to other discussions at this conference, whether we think of the enforcement plenary yesterday, or some of the workshops like the one that took place on victim standing in court, or the one on reversing state capture, because in all of these contexts, strategic casework by NGOs can make a big difference, and is in many cases, in the case of context of grand corruption or state capture, is vitally needed. So strategic casework may be especially valuable when state law enforcement action is weakened or undermined by grand corruption or by the lack of independence, resources, or capacity of law enforcement agencies. So with that, I'd like to turn to our speakers. And first of all, Charlotte, you are the litigation and advocacy officer in the illicit financial flows unit at Transparency International France, and also contribute to the strategic litigation work at TI France, which has been initiated in connection with grand corruption and ill-gotten gains cases. And you previously worked in the Ministry of Justice in France, monitoring some of the work of the Financial Action Task Force. Now, we know that France is one of the few countries that provides for anti-corruption NGOs to have broad and quite effective standing in corruption cases to bring complaints. So it would be really interesting if you could refresh or remind our audience of the history of how TI France achieved this legal standing and what it has changed for the fight against corruption in France.
Yes, so obtaining legal standing for anti-corruption CSOs in France has been a long judicial battle that started more than 15 years ago with the famous ill-gotten gains cases. So the story of ill-gotten gains in France started with the publication in 2007 of a civil society report documenting how a number of foreign leaders might have sheltered their illicit fortunes in France in the real estate sector. On this ground, several NGOs, including TI France, have filed complaints against these leaders for laundering misappropriated funds in France. But the first complaints were dismissed by the French prosecutor because they were still reluctant at the time to conduct investigations against foreign leaders. So to bypass the prosecutor decision, TI France and other CSOs filed another complaint to be recognized as civil parties against the same leaders, including Théodore Obiang, former vice president of Equatorial Guinea. And the perseverance of French CSOs finally led to a first huge success. In 2010, the French Supreme Court recognized French anti-corruption CSOs the ability to have legal standing in corruption cases, and it was then confirmed by the law in 2013. So the investigation kept going on and led to a first conviction against Théodore Obiang for money laundering derived from corruption, and all his assets have been confiscated in France. So obtaining legal standing was obviously a huge success, but the ultimate goal was to obtain accountability and the restitution of assets to the spoliated population. So in parallel of the investigation, TI France and other CSOs advocated for the creation of a legal specific framework that would allow the authority to return the confiscated assets to the people of the state of origin, even without an MLA request. And the second success was that in 2021, a legislation on responsible asset restitution was finally adopted by the French Parliament, and it promotes transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness during the entire asset restitution process. So these ill-gotten gains cases really opened a new avenue to fight ground corruption in France. Strategic litigation is an everyday battle, but it has also been a game changer for CSOs in order to initiate legal proceedings, advocate, and change social norms. And we have seen that with particularly complex offenses, CSOs can overcome potential inertia of law enforcement authorities and bring key evidences coming from its network, investigative journalists or other foreign CSOs. And in the meantime, with a civil party status, CSOs can advocate for victim rights through the asset recovery process and claim for their compensation. So just in terms of key figures, 15 years later, thanks to French CSOs in strategic litigation, we have 2 foreign leaders that have been convicted in ill-gotten gains cases for money laundering, 3 anti-corruption associations that have been granted legal standing, more than 20 ill-gotten gains that are under criminal investigation or judicial inquiry, and 250 million euros that have been confiscated, with first restitution occurring now with Equatorial Guinea. So cases are happening, and we think that CSO can even use strategic litigation a bit more.
Well, thank you for that. I think France has really put itself in the spotlight by establishing this groundbreaking framework for civil society, partie civile, I think it's called, and also that you not only, TI France and other NGOs help to pave the way for that, but also to this law on restitution. You mentioned the Obiang case. What happened with the restitution in that case?
So 150 million has been confiscated. Mm-hmm. Now we are in the phase of the sale of good in order to turn the assets into money. And we are ongoing on the first restitution of 6 million. And there is a negotiations between France and CSOs at Equatorial Guinea in order to select a project in which the money can be invested.
And a quick follow-on on that. Do you see this model as something that could be replicated abroad?
Yes. I think that first CSOs can initiate to fight for legal standing, to advocate for legal reforms that allow us to file criminal or civil complaints and participate more effectively in legal proceedings. They can also engage in advocacy efforts at the domestic, regional, or international level to promote policies that prioritize a responsible asset restitution mechanism. And we've seen that with strategic litigation, with international ramification, one major key point is also that CSOs can really collaborate with each other cross-border to facilitate the recovery of assets that may have been transferred internationally. So they really can help each other to track and obtain the seizure of assets located in different countries. And we have seen this in TI France, where many foreign CSOs came to us providing key information in order to initiate legal proceeding or to complete ongoing cases. Of course, CSO can also bring their case abroad by strategically choosing the country with the most favorable legislation in terms of asset recovery proceedings. So this is what we call forum shopping. And by doing so, they must wonder, does this country have a link with my case? Does this country have legal standing? Does the country provide redress for victims? Has a responsible restitution mechanism? Today, the challenge in France is also to reinforce legal standing for foreign CSOs so that they can initiate proceeding alone without TI France, but also join them, as for now, too few foreign CSOs are represented. And this is why we are proposing at TI France for 2025 and 2026 to provide trainings to foreign CSOs that might be interested in bringing their cases in France on French criminal procedures.
That really sounds interesting. You're describing a huge potential for this type of litigation, and also that's a very nice offer you're making for training. Thank you. We're going to turn now to Adriana, who is in Mexico. So you're co-founder of the Mexican NGO Tohil, and also its co-director since 2018. You're also chair of the Anti-Corruption Commission of the Mexican Bar Association, and you're engaged in many other activities, which I won't go elaborate on, but including being a very active member of the UNCAC coalition, which is very much appreciated. Tohil is known for its impressive fight against for anti-corruption associations to have legal standing before Mexican courts. Can you tell us a little bit about the main stages of your fight to get that recognition, and perhaps also the challenges you faced? And also, can you let us know how the victims of corruption can change the record of impunity for corruption crimes, which is exactly what we want to see?
So thank you for everyone for being here so early on Friday. We are in my organization very much fan of what the work you are doing in France, and I know they are like pioneers. So for me, it's very exciting to be sitting here with all of you who have done amazing work. In our side, when we talk about strategic litigation, you have to think about creativity. And this is how the work in Tohil started. We were, and our main objective still is to clean in the inside house. This means to clean the institutions that are clean from corruption, the institutions that are in charge of investigating and prosecuting the cases. So when we talk about our organization in comparison to organizations, for example, in France, our main objective is to clear what we call institutional corruption. So what we did, and what the main problem was, that these institutions had to investigate themselves in corruption, and that obviously we had a little problem. So what did we do was to think, what is a clear mechanism to be able to do a counterbalance? And we found a law that permitted that in cases of corruption and other crimes that had collective damages, victims could be this counterbalance. Not only to have the legal standing to present or to file the complaint, but also to actively present evidence, actively challenge the prosecution office if they decided not to take the case or investigate it correctly, or to obviously challenge the judge in case of dismissing certain evidence. You, as a victim, could challenge that. So we found this provision. We were creative and said, oh, this is incredible, because we can be, if we are recognized as victims of corruption, then we could file, not only file the criminal complaint against some institutional corruption, but also kind of, and I'm going to be very careful of what I'm saying, but private prosecution. You could collaborate with the prosecution to take this forward. So we decided to do that. Our first case was in 2019, 18 at the end of 2018. There was this great scandal of embezzlement from the government, a local government. So that wasn't the problem. So we didn't go for the corruption case of the embezzlement. What we did is this guy, this ex-governor, had bribed the system, had bribed the prosecution office, the federal prosecution office, for him to have better chance, or what we call like a fewer sentences, a few years of sentence. So instead of going for the embezzlement, we went for the bribe. So we said, what is going on with the prosecution, the bribe between the governor and the prosecution? This case was very interesting because it was the first case we alleged legal standing. Obviously, the first judge dismissed it and said that was crazy, that obviously there was no victim in corruption, that who had like the direct damage. They were looking for a direct damage. And what we did was we went and challenged it to a federal court, and this is for the first time I think in the entire region, an NGO was recognized as a collective victim, alleging a victim's law that said when crime is affecting the collective good, then NGOs could represent, because it's very difficult to point down who had a direct damage. So we got this recognition, and obviously it was challenged again by the prosecution office. And at the end, in the highest court, 2-1, they voted against it. But one of the magistrates that filed, she did an amazing particular vote where she explained in a very beautiful way how it was so important for NGOs to participate, because there was the only way to be a counterbalance in institutional corruption. So this case in particular, we said we have to knock regional mechanisms. So we went to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Did I say it correctly in English? Sorry for I'm thinking in Spanish and translating as I speak. So we knocked the door and we had a first obstacle. The first obstacle is that obviously these international mechanisms don't allow NGOs to present petitions. You need to do it on an individual basis. So this was our first challenge, and what we did is that my associate and me, as human rights fighters, as human rights defenders, said that we were using the NGO in Mexico as a mechanism or as a vehicle to defend human rights. And we took this case and we filed it against Mexican government for, we tied it to the Article 25 and 8, which was due process and the right to defend human rights, so to be able to defend human rights. So what we were alleging, saying is, if you don't recognize us as victims, then we are not being able to properly defend human rights. And this is, there was something very important in the same time. We filed another case, and this other case, strategically, we did not gain legal standing as victims, but the state in one of its resolution accepted the existence of a human right to live in a free environment, free of corruption environment. So this happened simultaneously, and when we got the recognition of this human right in Mexico City, we put that in the petition against the Inter-American Commission, and we said, the Mexican state has already accepted that there is this right, and we are human rights fighters, so we are defending this right, and that's how we enter the Inter-American Commission. So this is very important and news breaking, because this is the first case that the Inter-American Commission, this regional authority, accepts a case that is not basically a human right, So this is funny because before they only accepted or admitted human rights, like traditional human right violations. And this is not a traditional human right violation. Although we have had a lot of sentences and recognition of the link between corruption and the violation of human rights, not necessarily the human right of living in a free of corruption environment had been recognized. So it was the second obstacle to be able to present a violation of a right that is not necessarily accepted, and that is part of the fight we are giving for this right to be a human right in itself. And well, that's the great case. We are now on a stage where the state of Mexico has been notified the transition of admission, and they had 3 months to answer, and for what I know, they did not answer, but that is good news. So the case, we know the times of the commissions are very slow, so we're still trying to do a little bit of advocacy, talk about this kind of human right and the importance of victims of corruption to be recognized, and that's the stage we are at. And I just wanted to add that we don't only do big corruption cases, which when you think about strategic litigation, you think about grand corruption cases. And we started doing a different mechanism, which we love, is to try to combat corruption cases in a smaller and more particular citizen way. So when we talk about strategic litigation, it's not only like looking for this grand case that's going to change everything, but also starting with the small cases and taking the small case to create muscle, we say it, in prosecution. So for example, for us, the objective is to sanction someone that committed corruption. So the impunity in Mexico is so big that small cases, if we bring small cases, that is like creating a muscle or creating experience in prosecution offices. So right now, we're also tackling corruption, identifying small cases through, we have this hotline, a chatbot against corruption that citizens can denounce their prosecutor or their police officer, and we are choosing small cases and taking them and collaborating with the victim, with the direct victim, and creating criteria, not only in the prosecution offices, but also with the judges. And this has worked a lot because then you would think prosecutors and judges are very familiar with these cases. No, actually, prosecuting corruption is hard. It's not easy. You have a lot of obstacles legally, and we are working with them to be able to like open the I don't know how to say that, the streets, like the.
Thank you, Adriana. Really, bravo. Yeah, congratulations. You've taken on a lot. And you're doing a lot, and it sounds like there's promising avenues in the inter-American system, generally. In addition, including your case, if you could very briefly just tell us why you think the Mexican prosecutors opposed your original application for standing.
Actually, the session was public and it's open, so we were sitting there looking at how the 3 judges, the magistrates, were deliberating our case. And one of the president of the colegiado, he said something very funny, but he said like, there is no proof of there being a damage, like a direct damage. Who? And he turned to look at like the audience and said, here was damaged because governor gave a bribe to a prosecutor to achieve like a benefit in sentence. So he said like, who here had a damage? And for us, it was obvious that everyone, because then this opens the avenue of impunity for everybody that commits. Obviously, we had written that down, but he turned around and said like, we cannot grant this because, and he said this very funny, a lot of NGOs and human rights defenders are gonna be here like challenging every decision the prosecution makes or every obstacles in a criminal procedure against corruption cases. And my answer, like for him, was like, I don't see anyone else like coming here in the middle of a day on a Monday at 11 o'clock challenging or asking you to help them, because we're trying to help you. I was like, we're trying to help the prosecution, not to like in their like criminal defense, o sea, in their criminal case. And that was the fear he had was that there was going to be thousands of NGOs trying to represent thousands of unidentified victims.
Yeah, I can imagine, I can see that argument being made. In fact, I mean, in France, the original complaint by TI France was not welcomed either, and they had to take that case to the Constitutional Court. So not always easy to get, but once you get the ball rolling, you can make a lot of difference, and it sounds like you are. Now we're going to turn to Gabrielle, who has a different kind of experience. Gabrielle, you're a human rights jurist, and you've been working as director of programs at the Platform to Protect Whistleblowers in Africa, which for short is known as PLAF. You've been working there since 2017, and since 2023, you're also co-director of a new initiative, Climate Whistleblowers, which sounds very interesting. PLAF, I understand, is dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and also builds on what the whistleblowers bring. So can you tell us, Gabrielle, PLAF has a unique cross-regional structure, I understand, and also acts as a bridge between Europe and Africa. So how does that work in practice?
Thank you, Gillian. I'd like to start with an example, which is the Congo LDAP revelations that we did in 2021. And Congo LDAP is a leak of 3.5 million documents coming from a bank called BGFI in DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And these 3.5 million documents, and they come from a source that I cannot say more about here, but you can imagine the risks coming with revealing such information. Reveal large networks of corruptions in the DRC, but going pretty much everywhere in the world. So you have money laundering networks in India, you have Swiss banks, you have Belgian businessmen, you have Chinese state-owned companies. So a huge amount of actors that participated in the pillage of the DRC over a period of 10 years. And when we got this information, what PLAF did was to create a coalition of media and NGO to investigate the information and to publish it. So over, I think, 120 articles and counting were published about this scandal. And while we were working on it, we were thinking about the next step, which is litigation, and which is translating this information into actual concrete legal action. Which has proven quite difficult at times. But with time, prosecutions have been opened investigations have been opened in France, have been opened in Belgium, have been opened in several countries, not all of them I can mention here. And complaints were launched in France with TI, in Switzerland with Public Eye, and in several other jurisdictions. This Congo LDAP revelation, I should also mention, was followed up with a lot of public action in the DRC with the Congo is Not Fossil coalitions. It got a lot of public reaction from the International Monetary Funds, from local NGOs, from local activists. Demonstrations were organized in DRC as well. So this leak has allowed to see variety of actors that participated in the leak itself, in the investigation, but has also ultimately contributed to the litigation and to the legal action that took place after that. And I think this leak is showing our unique position, like you said, between Europe and Africa as a whistleblower protection organization, as an organization that works with witnesses, works with people who are at extreme danger for revealing information, and as an NGO that participates with a lot of different actors, prosecutors included in the global north and the global south. And in this position, as PLAF, as an NGO, we've seen incredible value in terms of advancing litigation and advancing legal action. First of all, and I think this is obvious, but I have to say it, corruption is incredibly international. In almost all cases, grand corruption or not, we can see some kind of international aspect to it. There will always be a Swiss bank account somewhere, a company in Panama, a Belgian businessman, an Indian money laundering network. There will always be something a bit international about it. In most cases, it will be incredibly international. We'll see a variety of actors from different places putting a lot of resources and being quite ingenious and smart about the way they conduct the network. The only way to react to that properly is to conduct our reaction in terms of litigation and legal action across multiple jurisdictions. If we go only to one, this is not enough, and we've seen it in multiple cases. If we have a couple of prosecutions opened, even if the prosecutor is not doing too much, even if the police locally is not doing too much, the mere fact that you have a couple of authorities with cases opened on the same thing is of incredible value. Of course, we're still lacking resources, we're still lacking the same assets that the other side has, but this is a first step to promote accountability. For us, as whistleblower protectors, and this is true also for witnesses and human rights defenders, working with multiple jurisdictions is also very important. First of all, we were talking about DLC. The DLC has announced investigations on Congo never opened any, which is not a surprise, given the political nature of it and the size of the investigations. But in other cases, the mere fact of having a Congolese whistleblower or a Zambian whistleblower or a Kenyan whistleblower that is a witness in a case in the UK or in France or in South Africa or in the US does a lot to protect the person. And we had the talk the other day with human rights defenders from Mexico, and this is true for so many cases as well. The second you make it international and you bring another kind of interest and value from another authority, you increase in, protection of witnesses and whistleblowers. In other cases where protection of sources was of incredible value was, so when you work with several jurisdictions and you bring them the case, they will say, this is fantastic, we won this, but we cannot commit to protecting the source of your information. Later on in the process, there will be a court hearing, and the other side might request to know the identity of the source, and we have no way of blocking it. Except other jurisdictions don't have that. So you can go to a third jurisdiction, give them the information, then they give the information to the first jurisdiction. Then you have a buffer in the Chinese wall. It's a bit dumb when you think about it because it makes no logical sense. But it actually achieves what you want to achieve, which is the first jurisdiction, the prosecutor you're working with, who wants to publish information, who wants to investigate the information, they don't want to reveal your source. You're providing them a very easy way to do that, and they cannot do that themselves. They cannot go wash their information through a third jurisdiction. I think the last part of it, and I think this is the part that is more essential for us, is that you have this variety of actors that are surrounding litigation and legal action. You have journalists, you have NGOs, you have local media, you have international media, and you have the prosecutors. All of this, to an extent, are essential for legal action. You need public pressure for the prosecutor to act. The prosecutor will actually want you to put some public pressure on them, so they will be forced to act. The journalist investigations will be essential because they are the only one who can actually analyze the data and create a case that is strong enough for the prosecution to act on, in many cases. The problem is many of these actors, especially internationally, they don't have the resources, or they don't have the network to act upon it. The NGO in DRC will not know how to quickly contact the DOJ and tell them, hey, this is it. I know in what format we want information, I will provide it to you, and I can do it in a way that will be legally protected. And the other issue is some of them are limited by deontology or even by legal limitations. So a journalist might very well want to see prosecution, but many journalists cannot go to the prosecutor and say, hey, this is my information, let me know if you need something else. I'm available for more action if needed.
So PLAF is bridging that divide, which some other entities, whether it's the prosecutors or the journalists, can't quite overcome, and bringing the information.
So PLAF, through its network and resources and the time committed, but also through the lack of legal obligations, can act as a bridge between so many actors, and especially prosecutors. And this is something we've seen and did not expect, is we have prosecutors or authorities contacting us and saying, I would like to tell the other prosecutor something else, but if I call them or go through my channels, this will take 2 months. You can tell them right away. Or the prosecutor will call us and say, can you tell the New York Times not to publish right now? We need 2 months for investigations. They cannot call the New York Times itself, but NGOs can. And I think this is where international NGOs play an essential part in allowing this collaboration to be quicker and to exist at all.
So that's a very important role, and maybe you only find that out. Maybe it's a little unexpected, but you find it out as you do the work, how valuable it is, maybe beyond even what you originally expected. But you're mentioning how this helps prosecutors, so I think that's a good moment to turn to Céline, who's a prosecutor, deputy head prosecutor at the Parquet National Financier since 2019, I think. If I got that,
we were created in, is that it? In 2013.
Okay, but I'm thinking of the role, maybe the role since, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, you've been there for a while.
That's
yep.
it.
And you've handled complex corruption cases. You've negotiated judicial public interest agreements in 5 separate cases, and you've represented the public prosecutor's office in sensitive trials. You've heard from the various NGO colleagues about the roles they've played, about maybe the reception they got from prosecutors. But how does the French model, which grants this broad legal standing to anti-corruption associations, how is it helpful? How is it helpful in detection or in other ways, as Gabrielle has been saying?
Okay. Well, thank you, and it's a great honor to be part of this panel, this workshop this morning, and to have discussions with the civil society and various partners. So I'm part, as you mentioned, of the National Financial Prosecutor's Office. It's a specialized prosecution office in corruption cases, also tax fraud cases, and other fields of complex economic and financial offenses. And we were created not that long ago, only 10 years ago. It's this year our 10 years anniversary. And there was a context for the creation of this specialized service in France. And partly in 2012, we were pretty badly evaluated by the OECD, and our results in fighting international corruptions were seemed as unsatisfactory. At the time, not even one company had been convicted in France for criminal corruption, and we had a long way to go. So the PNF was created in that context, and at the time, it was often the case in France to have investigating judges to deal with those complex cases. In France, you have 2 different ways of conducting investigations. The public prosecutor can conduct investigations, generally the most simple ones, and we directly work with police units. And you can also have an independent judge conduct investigation. It's an investigating judge, and they have more powers than we have at the public prosecution service. They can have persons detained, they can deliver arrest warrants, and they have a procedural framework that enables them to deal with those complex cases more easily. But those proceedings are often very long because the parties, the suspects, the victims, have access to the file. They can challenge the decision, nearly all the decisions of the judge, and so this process can be very long. Charlotte mentioned the ill-gotten case that was opened in 2007 in France. One part of it is ended, but there are still other investigations related to this big issue pending in France, and the investigation is conducted by an investigating judge. And in fact, it has been so long that 3 different investigating judges had to work on this case. So when the PNF was created, the idea was to maybe work a different way and to have specialized prosecutors in a capacity to handle investigations in those complex matters, but with a secret file without any parties having access to it, and also in a more quick way. So this being said, and to get back to your question, in the French model, I have to remind you that the victims have an official place and an important role. In the criminal proceeding, they can be at the beginning of the process with an alert, information that they got and that they want the police or the prosecution service to be informed of. They can also, of course, file a complaint if they have suffered from damage directly. And if we decide to investigate, but at the end of the investigation decide to close the case without prosecuting, or if we decide not to investigate, it can happen, they have the right to challenge our decision. They can say to our direct hierarchy at the Court of Appeal, hey, I had a complaint and the prosecutor did nothing. He closed the case and I think that he is wrong, so could you have a look at it? And our Prosecutor General can ask us to reopen the case or to open it. And they have another way to challenge our decision, which is to have an investigating judge reopening an investigation that we would have ended. And this is a very important proceeding. It's called Constitution de partie civile in France. And so they have direct access to an investigating judge to have him reanalyzing the case, and the investigating judge can decide that the case should be investigated more thoroughly, and that maybe we could find other element, proof that could, in the end, enable prosecutions to be considered. And when the judicial investigation is open and conducted by an investigating judge, they are party, formal party in this process. They can challenge the decisions taken by the judge. They can also request certain investigation to be conducted. So they have not exactly the same rights or way of working that we do at the Public Prosecution Service, but they have an important role in the process. And there is a last possibility for the victims to act and to have a trial, to get a trial. They can directly summon someone to the criminal court. So, for instance, we have conducted an investigation at the Public Prosecution Service. We esteem that the file is not strong enough, that there is not enough evidence, but the victim can find that we are wrong, and she will summon on the basis of our investigation. So this is a large panel of possibilities. And it was interesting to have in mind this evolution and how the anti-corruption association, the CSOs in France, obtained a place of victim and were able to strategically litigate in many cases. So a victim in the French criminal proceeding is normally a person who considers himself wronged by a criminal offense, directly wronged, and so they can seek compensation. That's what a victim is. So an association, of course, depending on its object, can be considered as victims. We have many associations that are direct victims of certain acts of corruption. And of course, anti-corruption associations who would have directly suffered from acts of corruption could exercise the rights of the victims in the criminal proceedings, all those rights that I have mentioned before. And through this very offensive way of working, some associations in France have even obtained more than that. We have a system in which some associations can be approved or certified in a way by the state and be recognized as unable to exercise the rights of the victims in a criminal proceeding without having to demonstrate a direct damage. So they are supposed, because of their objective, to represent victims in those criminal proceedings. So there are a few anti-corruption associations that in France have this certification, and they are, for us, very interesting partners. We work with them informally and formally. They can come to us to inform us of certain information that they obtained through their network. They can alert us, formally alert us, so that we open an investigation. They can also file a complaint, because with a complaint, they will be able, if we disagree on the necessity of opening an investigation, they will have access to the investigating judge, an independent one. They can challenge our decisions, as I just mentioned. They can also stand behind us, and it's sometimes very helpful for us, because those corruption cases, either national or international, are always very difficult to tackle for prosecution services, and it's sometimes good to have allies with us. So during the criminal proceeding, at the trial, sometime in the media, and of course also in the public debate through the advocacy work, the anti-corruption associations, the CSOs, the NGOs are our partners for sure, and are of great help in the conduct of our investigations. I have to mention that for better also knowing of the French system, that until 2013, we, in the public prosecution services, could receive individual instructions from our hierarchy. And this could be, in sensitive matters, of course, an issue. And this way of working, if I may say, these individual instructions were suspended and abandoned now 10 years ago. But the French public prosecution service is still under a hierarchy, and our supreme chief being the Minister of Justice, so a political authority. And so it was important, so we are not seen as fully independent because of that link. But without individual instruction now, we can act more, I think, freely in those sensitive cases. So now to get back to your question about detection, through this complete framework, the information, the interactions, the discussions that we have with CSOs are of great help to conduct our investigation. In the field of international corruption, it's always very difficult to get the first information to begin a case, because it's not always in France that things happen. And, well, you cannot always count on the institutional partners to alert us. Maybe sometimes they detect things, but they are not sure. Also, some institutions or partners or lawyers can be afraid of the consequences that they could suffer if they file a complaint. So in 2021, through this OECD mechanism of evaluation of the countries that are party to the Convention fighting for international corruption, we were asked at the PNF to look at the way we get detection. And I must say that anti-corruption associations bring us much of our cases. Our first partner for detection is the French FIU. Then it's the foreign judicial authorities. We open many cases through MLATs that we receive, or through transmission, spontaneous transmission of information. Sometimes also it's through national investigation that we discover elements related to international corruption, and that we decide also to investigate that. But in the fourth position, the anti-corruption associations are the ones who detect and inform us. So this is a huge role, and you can see that the institutions are after in the list, the anti-corruption associations.
No, that's really welcome news. I think there's some really positive feedback there about the role of NGOs, and
yes,
whether it be TI France or PLAF, and in kind of also overcoming perhaps barriers to international cooperation.
Definitely.
Really, really interesting to hear. I hope we come back to that. I mean, we're really grateful to you for bringing this perspective onto this panel, because, you know, sometimes it might sound like we're just singing our own praises and singing about our own value, but I think you're really confirming that it is very valuable for NGOs to play a role in these processes. So that's really, really interesting. And I hope we'll have time to follow up with you about any specifics. Now we're going to turn to Maria Jose, who is bringing another perspective and also a look at different types of casework. And Maria Jose, you're the Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Officer at the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Geneva. You served also as an OHCHR officer in Honduras. And you've also worked for NGOs and for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which we heard about earlier. So you have a really broad experience. Now, we know that corruption has terrible impacts on human rights. What do you think, how could strategic litigation before human rights bodies or jurisdictions, whether domestic, regional, or international, reinforce the fight against corruption, in your view?
Thank you, Gillian, and it's a pleasure to be here and sharing the panel with all of you and hearing of all of this very interesting casework and different avenues to obtain, for victims to obtain access to justice and redress. I'm going to be a little bit broader than your question, Gillian, and not only speak about possibilities of accessing human rights mechanisms with specific and concrete cases, but also other possible avenues of advocacy before the UN human rights mechanisms with casework, specific cases, or with more general situations. And this goes back, and I've been in other panels where I have repeatedly mentioned till I get tired that corruption impacts human rights and can violate human rights. Very specifically, this is not an abstract phenomenon. And in many jurisdictions, still victims face legal hurdles to access justice and to obtain concrete reparations. And as I was listening to Adriana when she was telling the case, and when the judge was asking, when one of the magistrates was asking, but who's the victim? And I was recalling almost 40 years ago, the General Assembly of the UN adopted the Declaration on the Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power. And this declaration says victims means any person who individually or collectively have suffered harm through acts or omissions that are in violation of criminal laws operative within member states, including those laws prescribing criminal and abuse of power. This was almost 40 years ago. So it's very important to keep this in mind, and this declaration also speaks about reparation and compensation. And before I go into the details of the mechanisms, we usually tend to think about compensation of immediate monetary compensation. But this is beyond, this goes beyond that. When we're speaking about human rights violations that are a result of corruption-related offenses that result from corruption, we're speaking more broadly about reparations. And reparations can take different forms. So it's important to keep that in mind. Also, and I'm sorry, Adriana, to bring you back again, but you know, when the judge was saying, I'm imagining here many NGOs coming here and asking and saying we are victims, we want reparations. Reparations can take many different forms, and specifically, I think in cases of corruption and human rights, we need to think about reparations beyond the specific funds or money that should be allocated to victims individually or collectively, but it goes beyond that, because reparation includes changes of laws, changes of mechanisms, adoptions of mechanisms to protect victims, and many other possibilities. So at the suggestion of Gillian, and because the mechanisms are many, I prepared I promise it's only one slide, PowerPoint, to be able to show the different possibilities. So the United Nations Human Rights Systems has two main mechanisms. One are the treaty-based mechanisms, and the others are the charter-based mechanisms. In the treaty-based mechanisms, you will find all the committees that are associated to the human rights instruments, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the main United Nations human rights treaties. In May 2021, 5 of these committees issued a joint statement on corruption and human rights. And in this joint statement, the committees indicated that they had been for several years receiving information about the negative impact that corruption has on human rights and on the different rights that are covered by these different treaties. And the committees indicated that they had been receiving this information not only on the periodic reporting, because these committees have 2 different functions. States have the duty to periodically report on the fulfillment of their obligations when they are parties to these treaties, but also some of these committees can receive individual complaints. They can receive cases. And the committees had been receiving information on corruption and on the impact of corruption on the rights that they covered, both in the periodic reporting of states and also on individual cases. And the committees welcomed this information and aimed that this joint statement was going to be guidance to member states on what are their human rights obligations related to corruption. And the committees analyzed the basic human rights obligations of respecting, protecting, and fulfilling human rights in the context of the rights that they covered. And they finalized by calling on civil society and member states to continue to present information. It is very important to say that states have a duty to report periodically on the fulfillment of their obligations, but civil society can present information to the committees on how the states are fulfilling their obligations under the treaties, and they can, and the committee calls on them to connect these rights with corruption, to make evident what's the impact of corruption on human rights. If you see the reports that the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, for example, issues their concluding observations after they review states, they have made it a standard practice in the past few years to include a section on corruption. And they ask states to identify the root causes of corruption and how are they impacting the fulfillment of the rights enshrined in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. They have also received information of corruption in the context of individual cases, though they have not issued a decision yet that specifically says this right was violated as a consequence of this specific corruption criminal offense. They have received information in this context, and there is a possibility that remains open to make that connection and to present cases to the committees when the state party has also accepted the jurisdiction of the committee to receive cases under them. But we also have the possibility of the charter-based mechanisms that are under the Human Rights Council. And one of them is the very well-known special procedures of the Human Rights Council that can be thematic, can be country-mandated. And we had participated in the conference Mary Lawler, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, who issued a very important report on anti-corruption human rights defenders. Special Rapporteurs have the possibility to receive individual complaints, and they can issue letters of allegations to states on specific situations, including of corruption. There are 45 thematic mandates, and they range from human rights defenders, right to food, etc. And finally, finally, the Universal Periodic Review, that is peer review mechanisms of the country's record on human rights. The UPR makes recommendations, specific recommendations to states, and there have been specific recommendations related to corruption and their impact on human rights. And just a final note on participation. I think it's important to mention that both in the UPR, in the sessions of the Human Rights Council, when the Human Rights Council is deciding on resolutions, adopting resolutions, civil society organizations can participate, they have a voice, and they can advocate for different elements to be included in those resolutions with the member states that are drafting these resolutions. There's no perfect mechanism, of course, but participation is a key element for access to justice, for reparation, and also for advocating for the advancement of corruption and human rights in the context of the UN human rights system.
Thank you so much for that. For covering a lot of ground in a very, very little time. It's very important for us to know that the UN treaty bodies, on human rights, are making the connection with corruption, between corruption and human rights, and that there are avenues for NGOs to bring case information and other information in that connection. Now, we've gone a little over time in our presentations, and we thank you for your attention on that, and we thank the speakers for the very, very interesting and useful information. It's now time for us to turn to you, the audience, to ask questions or add to experience that you may have on the subjects we're covering here. So with that, we'll take 3 questions initially, and then we'll see how much time we have. We have one person here, there, and over there.
Hi, good morning. My name is Jorge, and I work in an NGO in Mexico City called DLM. And the question for the panelists is as follows. Considering that today's fight against corruption and impunity for corruption channels through negotiated justice, the question would be, do you think that this type of justice and this type of agreements provide the sufficient mechanisms for a victim's reparation? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think we had someone over here. I think we'll take 4 to start with.
Good morning. My name is Sanjay Modi. I'm General Counsel at the Century. I commend the work of the CSOs in undertaking strategic litigation. And as I was hearing your remarks, my immediate thought was, this sounds incredibly expensive. And so my question is about the fundraising environment for the work that you do, and particularly given the importance of CSOs in France that the public prosecutor mentioned. I was curious whether there's any prospect for receiving public or governmental support for your efforts. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Behind? Yep.
Good morning, Franz Chain from the OECD Anti-Corruption Division. Thank you very much. Following a little bit on the first gentleman's question, because it touches on it, I was wondering about whether you consider the rights of victims from the so-called supply side of corruption, where companies basically are being investigated and prosecuted and sanctioned, whether through trial or non-trial resolutions. And in a few countries, whether by policy or on a very ad hoc basis, the rights of victims and the possible reparations that they may be entitled to have been considered, but in very, very few, and certainly not in a very systematic way. So I'd be grateful for whether this has been given some thought by the CSOs that are already acting from the sort of a demand side of bribery, or more generally from your different constituencies. Thank you.
So in other words, you're referring to the companies that are paying bribes and therefore causing harm.
And being sanctioned, but
Yeah.
so far the sanctions don't necessarily include an element of reparation.
Thank you. And we have a fourth question.
As the panelist said, in Mexico we live in a justice crisis. And right now we are discussing, I don't know the people who is not from Mexico knows, but right now is discussing a judiciary reform. It seems like this judiciary reform is more about take control over that power than a real reform that is needed for improving the situation in the judiciary and the justice system in Mexico. How we can go on a strategic litigation with this kind of a scenario that is in front of us. It seems like this reform will pass without problems. And also, as Ukraine have been supported by the international community with this big crisis, with invasion by Russia, there is the international community and NGOs and countries are aware and are disposed to help countries like Mexico, where the civil spaces are being closing, where make litigation has been every year more difficult, and, for example, with this law of foreign agents. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that first round of questions. And I think I'll ask different panelists to respond. We have a question about the role of NGOs in the context of deferred prosecution agreements, and added to that the context of deferred prosecution agreements or other cases which involve companies paying bribes. So let me ask Charlotte and Celine perhaps to address those questions.
Yes, it's a very interesting question because we've been recently conducting a study on this point at TI France. And it's true that DPAs are particularly interesting tools for obtaining multinational accountability because we will have some substantial fines and avoid the criminal route that can be a bit lengthy. But what we've noticed is that DPAs are still struggling with one of their main objective is compensating victims of corruption. And I just wanted to share first an international data before giving a few data on what we've noticed in France. It is from a report from the World Bank and the UNODC. Negotiated court rulings on international corruption have resulted in a total of $6.9 billion in financial penalties. Nearly 6 billion of this amount was recovered by the countries of origin of the corrupt companies, and of the 6 billion, only 3% was returned to the countries of origin of the corrupt public officials. So it gives a little bit of insights. And in TI France, we recently carried out a study on the role of the king in DPAs in France, so that can compensate tax, probity, and environmental offenses. And we've noticed that there is still progress to be made. Just to give you key figures, 24 out of 54 DPAs have ultimately compensated victims. Only 61% of identified victims have been compensated, and the identification of victims is mainly done at their own initiatives. So we see that we need to raise awareness on this mechanism and give prompt information to the victims, make sure that they are integrating at an early stage during the investigation. Yeah. And it's important also to recognize various a range of victims and to recognize different type of losses and harms that can be done. So yes, and I have the study with me, so for those who are interested, I can share with you in French or English.
Thank you for that. That's really important information, and that to build on and to see what kind of changes need to be made. Céline, what do you think about that?
I can say that TI France shared their report with us, and it's very interesting, and we are going to analyze that very thoroughly. I think that it's true that in the negotiated resolutions of cases, the victims are sometimes not in the center of the negotiation. And it is surely something that has to change. And we have to think about it in the way we conduct negotiations. So in France, we have adopted in 2016 the equivalent of the American DPA, which is the French CJIP, Convention Judiciaire d'Intérêt Public. And in that system also the victims have a place, a role, and we are supposed in the phase of the negotiation to contact the victims which we identified and enable them to ask for damages. And in some negotiations, either direct victims or anti-corruption associations had the possibility to ask for damages. And at the moment, we are also negotiating CJIPs and trying to give more place to victims. So this is, for us, an important issue and something we would like to improve in France, for sure.
Well, that's really encouraging news, and I hope the message is heard widely. So the next question is about costs. Isn't this all very expensive? And shouldn't perhaps some allocations be made for NGOs to take on this kind of work? Adriana, what do you think about that?
I'm gonna be very honest. Like when we started 5 years ago to raise money for strategic litigation was very hard, and we had to make up public policy investigation or a report, and underneath that, in our spare time, we would do litigation, and that's how we started raising money. But I think the scenario has changed, and mainly because spaces like this allow us, NGOs, to talk about the importance of changing the law within the law, and it's ridiculous to say it. But in the last 2 years, we've seen a change in the donors, international donors' mind. And now they are giving a lot of money for strategic litigation. They have understand that one of the biggest change is being made within the judges, within the prosecution offices, and not necessarily understand that that means confronting the government. Also, when we start looking for money, many bigger NGOs or donors said that we don't want to give money to little NGOs that are fighting the government, because that can be a little bit dangerous or a source of power confrontation. And that doesn't mean, we have shifted in the last years to understand that fighting for, in representation of victims or combating corruption doesn't really mean to confront the government. It actually means helping them do their job. So I've seen a better scenario in the past years.
Well said. That's well put. What about the question about the justice crisis in Mexico?
That is a very complicated question, but I think just to answer it a little bit quickly, I think that there is a misunderstanding between the executive and the judge system in Mexico. I think that we are living in Mexico an entire regime change. For good or for bad, we are changing a lot of the rules that we used to use, and we have a mechanism, which are the judicial power, that are putting obstacles, and that's natural in a democracy. And now we see the executive trying to diminish that power so that their plan of a transformation goes through. But in the overall, I think that the change in the judiciary that is proposed, not all of it is bad. I think there are things that can be integrated. For example, internal affairs and the mechanism of control over the judges. I think it's completely necessary to make, we have to question ourselves if we are wanting for judges to be making laws or only applying, which is not clear in Mexico. So that's another question that we should be asking, and I think it's good to be out there. Obviously, I am against, and I think anyone against about voting judges, and I don't think that's going to go through, but voting for judges, I don't think that's going to go through, and I don't think that should be, and that's it, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We may come back to at least one of those questions, but let's just see if there are more questions in the audience. I see 3, 1, 2, and 3. If we could have the mic over here.
Hi, everyone. Carlos Guerrero from Mexico, from a non-profit organization, DLM. Is it fair to say, this is mainly directed to Adriana and Maria Jose, is it fair to say that we should, as civil society organization, move forward for international litigation, since in our countries the changes are not being made by the governments or even by the judges? And sometimes, and this is more directed to Maria Jose, sometimes the international mechanisms are not acknowledged by civil society organizations. So how can the UN could put these kind of mechanisms closer to civil society organizations all over the world?
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Andres Hernandez from TI Colombia. I just wanted to add something to the equation, which is the need for actually working with victims of corruption in raising awareness about that they are really victims. We've been conducting this in many places in Colombia, and when you actually talk to people, they don't realize necessarily and automatically that they are being victims of corruption. So it's part of the equation that sometimes we don't have so clear, but it's when we look at the strategies and even funding opportunities, it is very important to have it very clear that those communities are fully aware, and therefore they need the capacity and the support to continue making part of this kind of processes.
Thank you. That's an important point. One more question, and then we're going to turn to the panel.
Yes,
and when those of you have the chance to make a response, please also make your final remark at that time. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. I'm Angela Reitmeier from Transparency Germany, and I have a comment on the DPAs, the Deferred Prosecution Agreements. I think in the UK we had the case that victims' compensation was included in their DPAs, but in a real case, in a trial case, it was not included. In the Glencore case, the judge said that is too difficult. It has to be litigated before a civil court. But I have a question for Celine. You've talked about your relationship with the CSOs, that they stand behind you. But I wanted to ask you about this new instrument of DPAs. Has that made it easier for you to also work with other jurisdictions, in particular the US? The US is always the jurisdiction that prosecutes most foreign bribery cases. Was that an important element? I'm asking because in Germany, we don't have DPAs and we have bad mechanisms. And my concern is always that if we had a DPA, it would make it easier, I think, to cooperate with other important jurisdictions. And is that true?
Thanks, Angela. I think we're gonna have to put that question to the after workshop discussion, because we only have a few minutes left, and I think we'll start with Maria Jose, and then I'll ask each of the panelists to say about 5 words in conclusion, because we're nearly out of time.
Thank you, Gillian. To Carlos's question, human rights mechanisms are another avenue for victims to obtain justice and reparation, and it should be seen as a bit complementary. Human rights mechanisms, when you file cases to the international human rights mechanisms, they are subsidiary to the domestic courts. The main responsibility lies in the domestic courts, but the human rights mechanisms are there as an option and another avenue. On the question of how to get the mechanisms closer to people, definitely you are right, and I think that's the idea of breaking the silos. There are many human rights organizations that have been working for decades in activating grassroots organizations in different countries, activating not only the UN human rights mechanisms, but also the regional mechanisms. And I think it's really important to bridge the silos between the two communities and work together towards bringing the mechanisms closer to the people. And of course, from the UN, we have to do our part to do the same. And just a final note on Andres's comment. I think it's really important, the awareness of the victimhood, but not only as people and communities that have suffered the harm, but also as right holders and agents of change.
Thank you for that. I guess I would ask if you can, just to say really a few words like a slogan to share with the audience, because we are out of time, but I'd like each of you to be able to say one more thing before we sign off.
Well, 5 words, that's it. We have to work together.
Wonderful. That's beautiful.
Thank you very much. That's all.
Can I answer quickly, very quickly? Something very important that is not obvious.
If you can say it in 5 words, that's
5 words. The fight against corruption in some countries are different from the ones where the money is coming out. So we're in different stages.
Yes.
And I'll go.
Yes. And it's a very important point. I'm sorry we don't have time to go into that.
Yes, just wanted to insist on the great opportunity of this panel to have a coalition of actors, because we see with such complex offenses that become more and more transnational that we have to work together. So I think it was a great opportunity to highlight this.
Absolutely. I want to thank this wonderful panel. I want to thank the audience for your attention. We hope this animates NGOs. We hope it animates the discussion about the subject of strategic casework. We hope it fosters more openness of law enforcement bodies to that role, and to create some momentum for this very, very important approach. So again, a big thanks to this panel.